Our next session is going to be on single audit updates. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Erin Clark, and I'm a member of the firm here in our Hagerstown, Maryland office. I've been with the firm just over 17 years, and within the government space, I primarily work with Maryland municipal clients in a combination of both audit and other outsourced accounting and advisory functions. So for those of you who either receive federal funds or perhaps have just been in the loop on things going on at the federal level, you're probably aware that there is additional guidance that is being discussed, additional overhauls that may be coming about. But I do just want to clarify that our discussion this morning is going to be specific to the 2024 uniform guidance revisions, which would be things that are currently in effect. And we're going to try to stay away from the things that are still up in the air at this point, but we will certainly share those if and when additional changes are made. But overall, the OMB has had three primary objectives in making all of these uniform guidance changes. First and foremost is surrounding the transparency and accountability, ensuring that there's proper oversight of all federal funds being spent, whether they are spent directly by the entities that are receiving the funds from the agencies or being passed through to subrecipients. They also wish to clarify the regulatory status of the Code of Federal Regulations. So again, historically, that has just been considered guidance. And the thought here would be to actually put this more into a set regulation to be able to have better enforcement. And then the third objective is to reduce the burden on recipients of these federal awards. If we start by looking at the timeline of this new uniform guidance, really the main trigger date is October 1st of 2024. So if you have an organization with federal awards that had agreements in place on or after October 1st, 2024, generally the new uniform guidance is going to apply unless your individual agency terms say otherwise. Now, I understand that many of you have fiscal years and therefore also grant periods that probably don't coincide with that 10/1 to 9/30 range. So it's very likely that you have existing awards that were in place prior to October 1st, 2024. If that is the case, you would continue to use prior uniform guidance unless you have an amendment that would have the revisions applicable in that. If you do have an award in place prior to October 1st, 2024, and your agency came out with an amendment to the award, you're going to want to read through those amendment terms because silence may not equal full conversion. And what I mean by that is that we've seen many agencies are adopting the new provisions kind of on a piecemeal basis. So some things are changing as of the implementation date, and then some have a further date of implementation further down the road. So you're going to want to read through those. And just because the amendment may be silent in a certain area does not necessarily mean that it's going to automatically default to the new uniform guidance. So in those cases, I would recommend reaching out to a contact within your specific agency for further clarification. And then lastly, we've also seen many of the agencies putting out communications with specific implementation guidance. So if that's the case, you're going to want to check with your specific agency on adoption terms, conditions, and especially if you're a pass-through entity, meaning that you are not the direct recipient of federal awards, but perhaps you receive it from another entity who is the direct recipient, make sure that you are communicating with them as well and have the ability to get any guidance that is provided directly from the agency for any specific implementation guidance. So again, a point of caution is that your organization may have awards governed by different versions of the uniform guidance at the same time. So whether that is because you have multiple federal awards with different grant periods, and some are governed under the old and some are governed under the new, you may also have just one award that is partially governed under old and partially governed under new. So again, just make sure that you're reading through that and following up as needed with any agency contacts specific to your award, especially if your award period crosses the threshold of that October 1st cutoff date. So now let's talk about a summary of the key changes that this new uniform guidance implemented. First and foremost is the single audit threshold. And for those of you that have received federal funding in the past, you're probably very aware of the previous guidance that had $750,000 as sort of the trigger. If you spent a minimum of $750,000 of federal funds, you automatically had a requirement for a single audit. The new threshold has now been increased to $1 million. And so getting back to those OMB objectives that we talked about, this removes some of the administrative burden for smaller governmental organizations to have a single audit requirement. Again, if it's in total above $1 million, you're still going to have that requirement. But if you're between that $750,000 and the $1 million, where you would have had the requirement previously, you no longer have the single audit requirement. Similar increase on the Type A threshold, and that gets into the major program determination in deciding what program or programs your auditors are actually going to test. Previously, that threshold was also $750,000, assuming total federal awards were under $25 million, which I assume most of you on the call are. If they're more than that, there is a slight difference, but for all intents and purposes, we're going to leave this threshold here that has also then increased to $1 million. So if you have, for example, multiple federal awards and maybe none of them individually from a certain agency or a certain federal assistance listing number is above $1 million, then you may not have a Type A program, but we would still then assess what we call Type B programs to determine, again, what gets tested and what we look at from an internal control and compliance standpoint. Another significant change for organizations that purchase equipment and supplies with federal funds is the increase from $5,000 to $10,000. So first of all, on the purchase side, this would be a time where you may consider aligning your capitalization and disposal of capital asset policies with the increase. So for example, if you had $5,000 as your capitalization threshold for capital assets, you may consider increasing that to now align with the changes. This is also important, though, if you dispose of equipment purchased with federal funds. So for equipment valued at $10,000 or less, you can keep, sell, or otherwise dispose of that equipment with no further obligations to the federal government. However, if you have equipment valued above $10,000, you can still keep or sell the equipment if certain stipulations are met. However, the federal agency is entitled to a share of those proceeds or current market value based on their particular contribution to the purchase. So you can generally retain a portion of those proceeds, but you may also need to repay a certain portion. Again, the prior threshold for that was anything above $5,000. That's now been increased to $10,000, again, in an attempt to reduce some administrative burden for those smaller dollar equipment and supplies. I did mention about aligning your capital asset policies, but I do want to just verify that this doesn't have to change the threshold. So for example, if you still decide as an organization that you're going to retain your current capital asset threshold for how you determine what assets to capitalize versus expense, you absolutely can still do that. I would not recommend increasing it above $10,000 though, because you want to make sure that you don't lose sight of this requirement, again, if you are purchasing equipment and supplies with federal funds. Another increase is the de minimis rate. So for those organizations that do not have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, you can use what is called the de minimis indirect rate to recover certain indirect costs. And previously that amount was 10% of your modified total direct cost base. Now that has increased to 15%, meaning it will allow you now to increase the amount of indirect costs that can be applied toward your federal awards, assuming that you have elected the de minimis rate and that it's properly documented by your organization. And then the last key change that we're going to talk about here is fixed amounts of subawards. So if you have a fixed amount subaward, if you are the pass-through entity and you are passing through funds to a subrecipient at a fixed amount, the threshold for that prior was $250,000. That has now been increased to $500,000. And the idea here is that that would provide more flexibility, but keep in mind that approval and terms with the federal agency do still matter and are still important for you to consider. A few other changes that I'd like to just highlight highlight here that aren't as notable but are still worth mentioning. Certain cost categories no longer require prior written approval from the federal agency. I would advise that you refer directly to your specific agreement for determination on whether this applies to you. Again, if you're following current changes that are potentially in play, you'll see that many of those may actually revert back, and additional cost categories may now require written approval that didn't previously. But under the current UG from the 2024 revision, we do have this sort of loosening up of those approvals. Another thing that sort of fell under the radar that a lot of clients didn't realize is that recipients and subrecipients must implement what is considered to be a reasonable cybersecurity measure to protect sensitive data and information. So if you currently do not have controls in place and you receive federal funds, to make sure that cybersecurity measures of protecting any data and information that would be confidential. Of course, the uniform guidance doesn't provide direct, specific information on what is considered reasonable, but you do have to make a good faith estimate, good faith effort to have those cybersecurity measures in play. The 2024 uniform guidance also got rid of the affirmative steps for engaging women and minority-owned business enterprises. So previously, certain organizations had to complete annually forms called MeBe-WeBe, Minority Business Enterprise and Women Business Enterprise reports. Those are now have gone away. They should still be considered, and they also have added veteran-owned enterprises for consideration, but there's no longer any affirmative steps to be taken in procurement to say, yes, we are actively trying to engage a contractor that is a women or minority-owned business enterprise. The guidance has also removed certain restrictions regarding geographic preference considerations in procurement. So while you still have the procurement clause and certain things that you have to factor in there, the restrictions surrounding certain geographic preferences has been removed. And lastly, pass-through entities are now required to ensure that subrecipients have not been suspended or debarred from federal contracts. So while that's always been in play for any contractors that you've done in procurement, this is now also a requirement for subrecipients as well. So just to wrap up here, some pre-audit considerations that I'd like you to have as a takeaway. Please make sure that you're going through all of your federal award inventory if you have federal awards, and tag each of those award or amendments to the applicable uniform guidance version. This will help you to ensure that you are using the right UG version in assessing what is applicable to your specific awards. You may also take this opportunity to do a policy refresh. So again, considering policies along the lines of anything that has thresholds in place, for example, the capital assets that we talked about, as well as procurement, cybersecurity, and again, if you have the indirect costs that you're using, make sure that your policies reflect any changes in the de minimis from the 10% to 15%. And then lastly, as you are preparing your CFA in preparation for your audit, you want to make sure you're confirming all federal expenditures, again, under the applicable guidance. Make sure that you still have a single audit requirement if the total expenditures are over $750 but less than $1 million. That may do away with your requirement altogether. But if you do still have, you also want to make sure you're continuing to track any COVID-19 specific federal awards. I know a lot of that funding has run out, but for some subrecipients, we are still seeing a trickle-down effect of that funding. So make sure you're still identifying those appropriately. And again, just keep in mind any timing of thresholds for those changes. Again, October 1st, 2024 being the main cutoff date to keep in mind. So I know that's very high level. I do apologize that I wasn't able to be here in person today to address any questions that might be in the chat, but please see my email address and phone number here on this last slide, and don't be afraid to reach out if you have any specific questions relative to your specific organization. Thank you so much.